It is known that Monsignor José, the Abbé Julio, was a close friend of the symbolist poet Fabre de Essart, who had been made a Gnostic bishop with the name of Tausinicius by Pappus, Sidir, and Chamuel. Another Gnostic body was founded by Jean Bricaud, a typical specimen of the lapsed Catholics in France who drifted into magic, occultism, and spiritism early in the present century. Born in 1881, he studied for the priesthood, but was so drawn to pseudo-mysticism that he ceased to practice his religion. By 1909, he had acquired the title of Président de la Société Occultiste Mondiale, as well as that of Patriarche de l'Église Gnostique Universelle. Subsequently, he rose to be Président du Suprême Conseil, Les Ordres Martinistes, and Grand Hierophant d'Orat Ancient and Primitif de Memphis Misraim. He also held the office of Rector de la Rose-Croix, which shows that he was a Rosicrucian. Bricaud became friendly with Monsignor Giraud, who may have raised him to the priesthood in 1912. What is certain is that the ex-Trappist monk consecrated the ex-seminarist on July 21, 1913, giving him the Gnostic name of Tau Jean II. The ceremony took place in the Gallican church at Saint-Amand, Roxavine. Tau Jean II gathered round him near Lyon a group of fervent Gnostic clergy and layfolk, and on May 5, 1918, consecrated Victor Blanchard under the name of Tau Targelius. The Patriarch published several books on magic and Satanism. He passed on in 1934 and was succeeded by Constant Chevillon, raised to the episcopate by Monsignor Giraud on January 5, 1936, with the name of Tau Harmonius. He was killed by German soldiers on March 22, 1944, after the Vichy government had suppressed the Gnostic Church. Monsignor Giraud and most of the priests and layfolk of the Gallican Church, even if not Gnostics themselves, were closely associated with them. Gnosticism was very much in the air 50 or 60 years ago. Even the Benedictine monks of Solesmes felt it worth their while to study what are known as the magic vowels used in Gnostic rites and ceremonies. In 1901, they published a book entitled Les Chants Gnostico-Magiques. Attempts were being made in England to spread these ancient heresies. For instance, by G.R.S. Mead in his Fragments of a Faith Forgotten. They fitted in quite easily with Theosophy and Rosicrucianism. J.I. Wedgwood, the future bishop of the liberal Catholic Church, was but one of many young Englishmen who dabbled in them. All over France, especially in the south and west, little groups of neo-Gnostics flourished. Most of them had their own priests and bishops, for it was believed that the magical rites could only be effective with an apostolic succession guaranteed to be valid. The next bishop to be consecrated by Giraud for the Gallican Church was Pierre Gaston Vie. He had been ordained priest by Herzog, the Christian Catholic bishop in Switzerland, and was raised to the episcopate on December 28, 1921. There was no danger of the Valois succession in France coming to an end, for on February 2, 1930, Giraud added to his hierarchy Bernard Isidore Jalbertville. This one-time seminarist and secretary to Monsignor Boccania, Bishop of Narni in Umbria, having failed to find a bishop in communion with the Holy See to give him even the subdiaconate, had no difficulty in persuading the Patriarch of the Gallican Church to raise him to major orders up to the priesthood. The ordination took place at Bordeaux in 1928, after which Jalbertville acted as curé of Gazinay. Some years after his consecration, he was given the title of Bishop of Elmira with the right of succession as Patriarch. On October 7, 1935, his beatitude, assisted by Vigue, raised Gerard Marie Edmond Les Conzières to the episcopate with the title of Bishop of Salmas. This new prelate was of humble origin. He had been a traveling hosier before he was ordained by Giraud in 1928, and then appointed archpriest of Saint-Louis de Gazinay. Shortly after this, the Patriarch and the archpriest published a Profession de foi de l'Église catholique, apostolique et gallicaine, which contained a preface by a Monsignor Maxime Androt of Paris, who called himself Prefect Apostolique. In 1937, Monsignor Girard, Monsignor Vigue, and Monsignor Lescouzer were among the clerics of various bodies who met at the Institut Suisse des Frères, otherwise the Schweizerische Diakonieverein, at Ruchiliacon, when it was decided to form the Ligue Œcuménique pour l'Unique Chrétien in the Holy Communion of the rediscovered Universal Church. The scope of the League was so broad that it found room for almost anybody calling himself a Christian. Filled with zeal for promoting the reunion of Christendom, the three Gnostic prelates returned to France. All seems to have gone fairly well until the early 1940s, when there was a violent quarrel between the Patriarch and his coadjutor, Jalberville. Acting not at all in the spirit of the Ecumenical League for Christian Unity, Girard deposed Jalberville for rebellion, insubordination, and acts of independence. The excommunicated coadjutor retaliated by opening a chapel in a house at Bordeaux, where he ordained several priests. Unlike Lescouzer, he was a celibate, devout so it seems, even if eccentric. He had private means, and had helped Girard in many ways in the past. Nevertheless, the Patriarch, having perhaps cursed Jalberville with some of the occult formularies found in the Abbé Julio's Livre de Grands Exorcismes et Benedictions, chose Lescouzer as his coadjutor with right of succession, convinced that here was a virtuous person, endowed with gifts to do good and fight evil under all its forms. Girard, who had wandered into many strange spiritual paths since he cast off the Cistercian habit, died in 1950, and most of his clergy refused to accept Lescouzer as their next patriarch. In defiance, he formed a rival sect to which he gave the name of l'Église catholique apostolique et gallicane, so Jalberville became patriarch after all, and he made his headquarters at Bordeaux. On July 24, 1951, he consecrated Louis Jean-Marie Fournier as évêque de la Gaule-Narbonnais. On August 12 that same year, Fournier raised an ex-Jesuit, Jean-René Malvy, to the episcopate. Meanwhile, Jalberville had assumed the impressive titles of Sa Béatitude, évêque titulaire de Almire par la Bénévolence sous son siège d'Antioche, primat de l'Église catholique française et patriarche de Saint-Siège gallican. 143 East, successeur de Saint-Pierre, apôtre dans la jeunesse jacobite. Towards the end of his life, this irregular prelate made his peace with the Catholic and Roman Church before Monsignor Richaud, Archbishop of Bordeaux, on March 19, 1955. He died on March 3, 1957. After Jalberville's reconciliation with the Holy See, the Église catholique française took for its leaders Bishops Vigue and Fournier, also a certain Monsignor Jean-Baptiste Brulé, alias Père Jean Vindy, who had been ordained priest by Girard and who had charge of 2 oratories at Bordeaux. There were also chapels hidden away at Toulouse, Angers, Lyon, Aix-en-Provence, and a few more around Bordeaux. This tiny sect could scarcely be regarded as more of a menace to the Catholic Church in France than were its counterparts to the established Church in England. Still, there was always the hope of making a few converts, and propaganda was carried on by the bulletin Le Catholique Français, edited by Père Patrick, who, like Hyacinth Loyson, had been a Carmelite friar. Jalberville employed him as private secretary, and he liked to add the initials OCF to his name as a symbol that he belonged to a select order of Little French Carmelites, whose members were said to live in stricter accordance with the spirit of Elias and the early hermits of Mount Carmel. It is possible, however, that they perpetuated something of the spirit of the interior sanctuary of the Carmel of Elias, founded at Lyon in 1856 by Vintras, the consecrator of so many. Judging from their publicity, the major apostolate of the bishops and priests of the Église catholique française has almost invariably been directed to faith healing and occultism. As 20th century Gnostics, they have tried to revive the ritual side of these early heretics, who practiced peculiar forms of baptism and confirmation, and who had their own substitute for the Catholic celebration of the Holy Eucharist. Their modern successors in France, however, when celebrating Mass, appear to have been content with a vernacular version of the Roman Rite. The ancient Gnostics, also Tibetan Buddhists, attached the utmost importance to the correct utterance of certain vowels, regarding each vowel as representing a musical note. One of the 7 planets are archons, and the 7 together as the pleroma of the universe. The Abbe Julio had initiated his disciples into the mysteries of cosmogonic speculations by means of geometrical diagrams and mathematical diagrams, guaranteed to develop the spiritual life. The teachings imparted by the first primate of the Velat-founded Gallican Church were regarded as divinely inspired by his followers. They were passed on to a second generation of tiny groups who met for worship, usually behind the locked doors of rooms in the back streets of towns or in remote country villages. It was the feeling of belonging to an esoteric little body that drew mystical-minded men, even more so women, to the Église catholique Francaise. They were, and still are, convinced that it offers a much more uplifting and soul-satisfying type of spirituality than that of the Roman Church. More select, more exciting, and above all, different. Nobody would venture to contradict this. On April 29, 1956, Vigue consecrated Ivan Gabriel Drouet de la Thibaudoire, Comte d'Erlon, who assumed the title of Monseigneur Gabriel de Saint-Méry. After Jaberville's death, the following year he took on the duties of regent of the Église catholique Francaise, with his residence at 9 Rue de Général Gallieni, Romainville, Sienne, where he edited the monthly review L'Étincelle, said to have been founded by the Abbé Julio in 1887. Meanwhile, Le Couzers did everything possible to stress the importance of his own rival church, and he assumed the impressive titles of Évêque de l'Église gallicane, Secrétaire du Collège épiscopal de l'Église catholique apostolique orthodoxe d'Occident, membre dirigeant de la Ligue œcuménique pour l'unité chrétienne. He moved his curia from Gazanet to the village of Montiel in the commune of Pessac, where he opened a small oratory dedicated to St. Vincent de Paul. His chapter consisted of 2 honorary canons, one of whom, residing in Paris, acted as prefect apostolic for the north of France. On April 19, 1953, Monseigneur Le Couser provided himself with a coadjutor in the person of Bernard Alexander Ducasse Haris, who had been ordained priest by Giraud. Another addition to the hierarchy of the Église orthodoxe gallicane autocephale was made sometime in 1956, when Le Couzers consecrated an ex-Olivetan Benedictine, Gaston Segers, who in 1953 had been married in Brussels by Bishop Ducasse Haris. The latter prelate assisted at the consecration, and the new bishop took on the duties of vicar apostolic for Belgium. Despite its liberal outlook, the propaganda and its bulletin, Le Gallican, and its willingness to provide a refuge for dissatisfied Roman Catholic priests, the Église catholique apostolique et gallicane has not managed to win many adherents. So far as can be discovered, this little body consists of handfuls of persons at Lyon, Cannes, and a few other towns in France and Belgium. It is difficult to keep up to date with any of these schismatic bodies. They are always quarreling among themselves and forming yet more splintered churches. Some of these obtain bishops from other lines of succession, or having done so, get them reconsecrated anew to ensure a more valid episcopal status. The allure of these tiny sects seems to be that they are chic and distingué, able to offer exclusive modes of spirituality and worship, not found in France's Grand Magazine Ecclésiastique, the Catholic and Roman Church. Yet another body of the Velat succession came into being on January 25, 1953, when Mar Justinos Thiessen, who then called himself Archbishop of the Old Roman Catholic Church in Germany, consecrated Jean-Marie Blom van Assendelft-Outland at Cologne. The new prelate returned to France, soon broke off relations with his consecrator, and opened an independent Old Catholic chapel in Paris. One of his first episcopal acts was to reconsecrate on July 11, 1954, the one-time ex-Jesuit novice Jean-René Malvy, who had been raised to the episcopate by Monseigneur Fournier, évêque de la Gaule-Narbonnais, on August 8, 1951. Monsignor van Assendelft-Outland, assisted by Monsignor Malvy on February 20, 1955, consecrated a doctor of medicine, Charles Borromée, Comte d'Echevin, and assumed the name as Archevêque titulaire d'Arles, a gesture of defiance against Monsignor Charles de Provencher, the then Catholic metropolitan of this 5th century see. A month later, Monsignor Assenfeld-Altland, who had now ceased to be associated with Mar Justinos, was in London, where on March 20th, 1955, he was reconsecrated in the Cathedral of the Good Shepherd, Chelsea, by Mar Joannes Nicholson, Archbishop of Karim and Primate of the ancient Catholic Church, assisted by Mar Peter Knill Samuel, titular Bishop of Naim. Enriched with many more lines of apostolic succession, he assumed the style of Archbishop of the ancient Catholic Church for France. In November that same year, the Archbishop of Karim consecrated the chapel opened by Van Assendelft-Altland at Chelles, Seine-et-Marne. By this time, the Église Ancienne Catholique had fallen into line in more ways than one with Nicholson's independent body in Chelsea. Having gathered round him a group of ladies reputed to possess charismatic gifts, Van Assendelft-Altland formed them into a community of spiritual healers. They were vested in white habits and known as Religieux Dominicains Soignants. Their convent was at Boulogne-sur-Seine. The following year, this Flemish prelate managed to acquire the exalted status of his sacred beatitude, Mar Joannes Maria, Prince Patriarch of the Église Catholique Apostolique Primitive d'Antioche, Orthodoxe et des Traditions Syro-Byzantines. This enabled him to proclaim that he was the 147th successor of St. Peter the Apostle as Bishop of Antioch. On November 18, 1956, the Prince Patriarch consecrated and crowned at Rome, though not in the Vatican Basilica where Charlemagne was crowned, His Imperial Majesty Marziano II, Lavarello Lascaris, Basilius of Constantinople, and of all the Christian Orient. This youth was believed to be the de jure 269th Roman Emperor, the successor of both Augustus and Constantine. At the same ceremony, the Dowager Empress Olga was also crowned. On May 2, 1957, the Prince Patriarch received his third consecration from Monsignor Erny. Just now, when and where this Antiochene Church of the Syro-Byzantine tradition came into being is not certain. No matter, its growth has been phenomenal according to official statements. In 1957, it claimed archbishops in Canada, Germany, West Africa, and Holland. A patriarch in South Africa, a missionary bishop in America, with jurisdiction over the Gold Coast, Nigeria, Liberia, Trinidad, and British Guiana, a primate with 2 suffragan bishops in England, an archbishop patriarch with a coadjutor in France, and bishops in Italy, Ceylon, and Malaya. 14 of these prelates, all of them with the prefix Mar, now form the sacred synod of this apparently vast international body. The fanar of the Patriarchate is at 149 Rue de Bagnolet, Paris 20E, the patriarchal pro-cathedral. Chapelle de Notre-Dame de l'Unité is a converted cellar at 36 Rue de Saint-Ange, Paris 3ME, furnished in exquisite taste, so a recent visitor relates. The Divine Liturgy is celebrated here, and the young and handsome Prince Patriarch, like the Archbishop of Karim, also conducts healing services with the laying on of hands and anointing with oil. The 1956 constitutions of the Franco-Byzantine Church suggested that in doctrine, polity, ritual, and ceremonial, it had much in common with the ancient Catholic Church of Chelsea and Clapton, out of which it evolved. The Église Primitive Catholique Apostolique claimed a total membership of 15 in 1959. It is ruled over at Paris by Monsignor Marc-Marcel Lamennais, a former liberal Catholic priest who was raised to the episcopate in 1937 by Giraud and Vigue. He is a practicing physician and holds his degrees from the Sorbonne. Almost as exclusive is the Sainte Église Apostolique, which evolved out of the Association Culturelle Archdiocésaine de Saint-Alich pour la France et Union Francaise de l'Église gallicane, catholique et apostolique, tradition Bossuet. Its founder, Monsignor Roger Renier, claims a Uniate Armenian succession. He is a militant Gallican, strongly opposed to everything ultramontane, and a firm believer in little independent churches, the more the better. It appears that his handful of priests specialize in faith healing and occultism, for strongly recommended to the faithful are the writings of the Abbé Julio, Monsignor José, especially his Livre de grands exorcismes et benedictions per antiques formules occultes, etc. The postal address of this mystic elite is BP 52, Colombe, Sienne. Last but not least, there is the Sainte Église Celtique en Bretagne, founded by Jean-Pierre Clodoald Daniel, born of French parents on June 22, 1917. He was baptized in the Romanian Orthodox Church. At the age of 32, he was rebaptized and confirmed in the Greek Orthodox Church at Paris. He felt called to found a French-speaking Byzantine Rite parish in France and had a following of 12 persons, but no Romanian, Russian, or Greek Orthodox bishop would consider raising him to the priesthood. On December 25, 1949, the Archimandrite Alexis van der Mensbrug, formerly a Catholic Benedictine monk of the Belgian congregation, admitted Daniel to the monastic state of the Orthodox Eastern Church. The French monk had no choice but to continue earning his living in the office of a paper mill, though he managed to find time to recite daily the whole Byzantine office. Early in 1951, he wrote to a liberal Catholic priest in England, "Where can I find a bishop whose orders are recognized by Roman Catholics and Orthodox, and who yet himself is neither, since neither church understands the needs of today?" This priest referred him to Marc Fatome, the Mariavite Bishop of France. An invitation to Nantes resulted, and on July 15, 1951, having passed a theological examination and been given minor orders, subdiaconate and diaconate, Daniel was raised to the priesthood and status of hieromonk. The Roman Rite in French was used for all the ceremonies. Not without reason, Père Daniel began to doubt if the orders he received would be recognized by Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox theologians, so he applied to the newly consecrated Monsignor Lutkin, Archbishop of Antwerp, Metropolitan of the Église catholique du Rite dominicain, who consented to pass on the 15 or more lines of apostolic succession received from Mar Georges, Patriarch of Glastonbury and Catholicos of the West. Having received all minor and major orders over again, Daniel was raised to the priesthood and made hieromonk for the second time on March 1, 1953, in Monsignor Lutkin's Pro-Cathedral Chapel, 41 Rue James Watt, Schaerbeek, Brussels. By this time, the hieromonk's interests had been diverted from Byzantium to Brittany after brief interludes with the Mariavites and the Belgian Catholic Apostolic Church of the Dominican Rite. Taking the religious name of Tugdull, he retired to Morbihan, where at what he called the Abbaye de la Sainte Présence au Bois-Juhel, near Saint-Dolay, he began to lead an eremitical life in emulation of the ancient Celtic monks. He was now dreaming of reviving the Celtic Church, which had existed in Brittany in olden times, very much as Richard William Morgan, Mar Pelagius, hierarch of Caerleon-upon-Usk, had done in the 1870s, where he tried to revive the so-called ancient British Church. Breton nationalism in recent years has led to some very strange activities, and it is not surprising that Tugdull the Hermit managed to collect disciples. On December 25, 1956, the General Chapter of the Order of St. Columbanus, with consent of the General Assembly of the Community of Brittany, whoever they were, elected Tugdull as first bishop of this new, or revived Celtic Church, in virtue of the act of nomination granted by the Siège ecclésial œcuménique. The bishop-elect, who had passed through successively the Romanian Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Mariavite, and Belgian Dominican Rite churches, looked around for a prelate to consecrate him, and eventually selected Monsignor Irenaeus, Archbishop of Arles, who at that date was primate of the so-called Sainte Église catholique gallicane autocephalie. In private life, Comte Charles Borromée de Echevannes, the co-consecrators were equally illustrious. Monsignor Comte Eugene de Bachitsky, titular Bishop of Berne and Geneva, primate of the Sainte Église Orthodoxe Ukraine, conciliaire autocephale and exil, and Monsignor Julien Erny, titular Bishop of Bienne, Switzerland, whose status of Secretary General of the Siège ecclésial œcuménique gave him an undefined jurisdiction over every continent. On May 2, 1957, Erny reconsecrated de Chavannes, giving him a spiritual blood transfusion of more than a dozen lines of succession. 3 days later, an imposing pontifical function took place in the pro-cathedral chapel of the Abbey Nullius of Boisjuhel when Tugdal assumed the title of Bishop of Redon. He went to the expense of having printed an 18-page brochure giving the fullest possible details of the 16 lines of apostolic succession believed to have been acquired: Syro-Antiochene, Syro-Malabar, Syro-Gallican, Syro-Chaldean, Nestorian, Chaldean Uniate, Coptic Orthodox, Armenian Uniate, Order of Corporate Reunion, Old Catholic, Mariavite, Non-Juring, Anglican, Russian Orthodox, Syro-Russian Orthodox, Greek Melkite, and Liberal Catholic. He had lost nothing but gained much by the refusal of Eastern Orthodox bishops in France to ordain him to the priesthood. Since his consecration, the bishop abbot appears to have continued to lead the life of a hermit in Brittany, praying for more vocations to his order of St. Columbanus, and convinced that his Holy Celtic Church is far more suited to the Breton temperament than the bureaucratic rigidity of Romanism. Visualizing suffragan bishops sooner or later, he raised himself to metropolitan status on December 19, 1959, with the title and style of Tugdual I, Archbishop of Dole. Prepared, if necessary, to face bitter persecution by the ultramontane bishops and clergy of the dioceses of Rennes, Vannes, Saint-Brieuc, Quimper, and Nantes, he is confident of an ultimate victory over the Italian mission and the reconversion of the Breton race to the church order of its ancestors. Like Mar Theophilus, the second patriarch of the ancient British Church, Tugdual I is trying to revive Druidic rites and customs which have lain forgotten for many centuries, and of which the only thing known to historians is that they must have existed. Time alone will show if Archbishop Tugdual I of Dole and his Sainte Église Celtique will prove more successful than Mar Frederick and his short-lived Orthodox Celtic Church of the British Commonwealth of Nations. Both bodies possess a certain affinity, and of all the countless sects claiming the Vilat succession, they are perhaps the most bizarre. 2. Offshoots of the Vilat succession in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, etc. As the progenitor of schismatic bodies, Vilat is also represented in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, where tiny groups of his spiritual offspring can be found if one cares to track them down. The Vilat succession in these countries started on December 28, 1921, when Monsignor Giraud, Patriarch of the Église Catholique Francaise, raised to the episcopate Pierre-Gaston Vigue, who had been ordained priest by Bishop Herzog of the Swiss Christian Catholic Church. Giraud provided another freelance bishop for Switzerland and Germany by consecrating Armin Robert Geyer in August 1925, who passed on the succession to a certain Karl Eugene Herzog on June 24, 1929, as bishop of a so-called Catholic Church of Germany. He retired to Switzerland with the title of évêque doyen until his death. On June 3, 1924, Vigue consecrated Aloysius Stumpfel, whose priesthood is said to have come from Bishop Herford of Mercia and Middlesex. Stumpfel assumed the title of Mar Timotheus, Orthodox mission bishop, with an undefined jurisdiction over Austria. Little is recorded of his activities during the next 20 years, but on June 1, 1947, he arrived in England as a destitute refugee. It was stated that the Legionary Bishop of Aquileia, who presides over the work of the Catholicate in Austria, has accepted an invitation to stay with His Beatitude the Catholicos in order to report on the work in Central Europe, and generally to confer with him and the other English bishops regarding the more technical points connected with the restoration of Orthodox Apostolic Catholicism. Mar Georges and his wife gave him generous hospitality for several months. On June 14th, the Patriarch of Glastonbury reordained the Metropolitan of Aquileia up to the priesthood, sub conditione, and on the 22nd of the same month, reconsecrated him by way of additional commission. 6 days later, Mar Timotheus reconsecrated Mar Leofric, Archbishop of Sophronia, who on July 14th reconsecrated Mar Georges. 4 days after this, the Metropolitan of Aquileia took part in a Salvation Army service at Canterbury, where a collection amounting to £3 3 was taken up on behalf of his persecuted co-religionists. He traveled around England explaining that he had ministered in Austria to Russians who were not in communion with the Patriarchate of Moscow. A fair number of Anglican incumbents, as well as nonconformist ministers, helped this supposed Orthodox prelate. It appears that on July 27th, he was reconsecrated once again, this time by Bishop Stannard of the Catholic Christian Church. But Mar Georges had begun to suspect this Austrian prelate, and on January 10, 1948, during the celebration of Pontifical High Mass in the Cathedral and Abbey Church of Christ the King, New Barnet, Hertz, he solemnly excommunicated by bell, book, and candle His Grace Mar Timotheos, Metropolitan of Aquileia, for sacrilege, superstition, etc., together with 2 other bishops, 3 priests, and 1 exorcist. Stumfel, having returned to the continent, consecrated 5 more bishops, starting with Frederick Weikart on April 14, 1949, who assumed the title of Mar Ignatius. 3 days later, assisted by Weikart, he raised to the episcopate Joseph Maria Thiessen with the title of Mar Justinus. Mar Timotheus died in 1951 without being reconciled with the Catholicate of the West. Mar Justinus, who made his headquarters at Cologne, had large ideas of his own importance, apparently believing that his jurisdiction extended across the Atlantic. As will be related in detail in the next chapter, he issued a bull on November 15, 1952, solemnly excommunicating several bishops of the Matthew succession in the United States. The omnipotent Mar Justinus consecrated Peter Libertram Potargent on September 16, 1956, giving him the title of Mar Macarios. Another addition to his loosely organized hierarchy was made on October 14, 1958, when he raised Manfred Apollos Streiger Werenpfennig to the episcopate, nominating him bishop of the so-called Hochkirche in Österreich. Mar Justinus has given another proof that he regards himself as the supreme pontiff of a universal church, as well as patriarch of the primitive church of Antioch, because it has been stated that on November 12, 1961, he consecrated at Munich a man named Joel S. Williams, at one time a licensed lay reader in the Anglican Diocese of Bombay. It is believed that Williams was ordained priest on January 23, 1955, and that he was elevated to archpriesthood on March 6th, the same year as spiritual head of the so-called Indian National Church. We are told that then he was unanimously elected bishop by all the congregations, continued as bishop-elect for about 5 years before he went to Germany to be raised to the episcopate as Archbishop of Bombay and primate of the Indian National Church. The French neo-Gnostic line of the Vallot succession found its way into Germany by several more clandestine consecrations, partly because none of the genuine Old Catholic prelates were prepared to add to the number of bishops at large. On August 25, 1930, Monsignor Vigue, who, since he ceased to be coadjutor to Monsignor Giraud, had given the title of Bishop Consultor of the Syro-Jacobite Episcopate in the West, with his headquarters in Switzerland, laid hands on a Lutheran pastor named Frederick Heiler. His assistant was Gustavus Adolphus Glintz, consecrated the previous day. Heiler assumed the title of Bishop of the so-called Communion Evangelica Catholica Evangelica. Born in 1892 and brought up a Roman Catholic, he identified himself with Lutheranism by communicating at the hands of Archbishop Soderblom at Uppsala in 1919. Greatly influenced by the mysticism of von Hugel, his theology developed on Catholic lines after 1922, when he was appointed professor of the comparative history of religions at the University of Marburg. As one of the leaders of the High Church movement in Germany, Heiler founded a Lutheran order of quasi-Franciscan tertiaries. Feeling called to the episcopate, he approached several Old Catholic bishops, but with no result, so he had to be satisfied with the Gallican stream of the Syro-Jacobite succession. He ordained several priests who continued to minister as the pastors of Lutheran churches. He became first president of the High Church Ecumenical Union of the Augsburg Confession in Germany, and he was also the co-founder of the Catholic Eucharistic Association of the Brotherhood of St. John. In October 1940, he consecrated Martin Geibner, Dr. Heiler belongs to another class from that of most of the bishops mentioned in this book. He is a world-famous scholar and the author of several widely read books. His chief work has always been to break down the barriers of ignorance and prejudice between Christian churches, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant. Chapter 9. Churches of the Matthew Succession. Old Roman Catholic, pro-Uniate Rite. Canonical Old Roman Catholic Church in communion with the Primatial See of Caerglau. Old Catholic Church in Ireland. Old Catholic Orthodox Church. English Old Roman Catholic Rite, Liberal Catholic Church, and 2 American schisms. The Church Catholic, Old Catholic Orthodox Church, Apostolic Service Church, Old Catholic Evangelical Church of God, Old Holy Catholic Church, Church of the One Life, Free Anglo-Catholic Church, and Order of L'Anthony Brothers, Old Roman Catholic Church, English Rite, Old Catholic Church in America, Catholic Church of North America or Orthodox Old Catholic Church in America, Independent Episcopal Church of the United States and Canada, North American Old Roman Catholic Church, Old Roman Catholic Church in North America, 2 groups, Diocese Vicariate of Niagara Falls, Mexican Old Roman Catholic Church, Église Catholique Évangélique, etc. During the 43 years of Arnold Harris Matthews' priesthood and the 12 years of his episcopate, he changed his religious opinions so often and so suddenly that it is never safe to attribute any convictions to him at any stage of his erratic career. It is improbable that this great priest, who in his days pleased God and was found just, as he is described on his tombstone, wished that any of the sects of which he was the progenitor should remain as his lasting memorial. At the time of his death in 1919, there were scarcely half a dozen people left who recognized his jurisdiction as Archbishop of London and Metropolitan of his so frequently renamed church. During the last 2 years of his life, so far as can be gathered from his letters, he left no stone unturned in attempting its reconciliation with the Church of England, although on what he considered to be reasonable terms. When he died in 1919, he was buried with Anglican rites by the vicar of South Mimms, Bishop Williams, who had been consecrated as his coadjutor with right of succession, was not informed of his death in time for him to be present at the funeral. Bishop Bacon, however, who had just returned from some years in Canada, was among the mourners. After that burial service at South Mimms, 4 independent little bodies in Great Britain and Ireland, as well as 2 in North America, could claim Matthew as their direct or indirect founder, in the sense that they derived their orders from him. Except for the liberal Catholic Church, which was growing rapidly and had bishops and priests in almost every continent, the other sects hardly counted numerically at all, and few people were aware of their existence. 1. Old Roman Catholic Church, Western Catholic Uniate Rite, now known as either the Old Roman Catholic Church in communion with the Primatial See of Caerglau, or the Canonical Old Roman Catholic Church, or the Old Roman Catholic Pro-Uniate Rite of Great Britain, America, and Canada. Having assumed the primacy of the Western Catholic Uniate Rite, otherwise known as the Old Roman Catholic Church, Bishop Bernard Mary Williams held a synod in north of England on January 17, 1920. Feeling unable to shoulder the burden of duties which were virtually non-existent, and not being too robust in health, he begged to be given a bishop auxiliary, since his theoretical status was now greater than that of the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster. Coitus episcopales totius Angliae et Cambriae praeses perpetuus. At the same time, he regarded himself as the opposite number of both the Primate of all England, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Primate of England, the Archbishop of York. Those present at the synod elected Monsignor Francis Bacon, titular Bishop of Durham, consecrated by Matthew in 1910, as auxiliary with right of succession. He had recently returned from North America after 4 years' absence from England. This versatile but unstable prelate resigned his office on October 1st that same year, leaving Monsignor Williams in sole charge of the Old Roman Catholic Church in Britain. The kind-hearted Dr. Winnington Ingram, Bishop of London, welcomed the titular Bishop of Durham back into the Anglican fold, and immediately found him a congenial curacy at St. Gabriel's, South Bromley, where the vicar was the Reverend W. M. Lambert, the one-time dean of St. Matthew's Old Catholic Cathedral in Islington, of which Bacon had been one of the chapter. For the next 7 years, this East End church served as the headquarters of the revived Order of Corporate Reunion, where both the vicar and curate were available to validate the orders of Anglican clergymen who wanted to feel they were real priests in the eyes of Rome. The Lambeth Conference of 1920 had declared that, should any cleric ordained by the late Archbishop Matthew seek to minister in communion with Canterbury or York, he must be reordained sub conditionae. Monsignor Williams was shocked and felt it his duty to point out that 5 of his predecessors' priests had been officiating in Anglican churches without having been reordained, and that one of them was the vicar of a London parish, meaning Lambert. The year 1920 saw the first of several Anglo-Catholic congresses, and with them a rapid increase of Baroque and Rococo furnishings in Anglican Papalist churches, which in some instances included an urge on the part of the clergy to ensure that their orders were equally post-Tridentine. This involved getting them rectified in an irregular manner by some quasi-Old Catholic prelate. In consequence of this, Monsignor Williams issued a pastoral letter in Advent 1920, addressing from the Edge, Stroud, Gloucestershire, stating that he himself had no intention of giving conditional reordination to any more Anglican clergymen, such as Bishop Bacon, following the policy of Matthew, was then done with a view to reviving the Order of Corporate Reunion. The following year, the Archbishop moved his metropolitan curia to a bungalow called Madam's Wood, near Painswick, on the western edge of the Cotswolds, where he spent the rest of his life. The numbers of his flock were infinitesimal, and it would be true enough to say that the old Roman Catholic Church existed more in his imagination than in reality. He had a tiny congregation at Bristol, and about this time he took under his wing 2 or 3 ex-Anglican Benedictine nuns, formerly members of the West Malling community, who called themselves Benedictines of Saints Mary and Scholastica. On April 11, 1922, the Continental Old Catholic bishops issued a joint statement to the effect that Matthew's consecration had been secured by the production of false testimony, and that it would never have taken place had the consecrators known that the conditions stated in the documents received by them were virtually non-existent. They stated that they had subsequently broken off relations with Matthew, and that without entering on the question whether an ordination obtained by sacrilegious fraud can be valid, decided that they could have no ecclesiastical relations with those persons who claimed to have received orders at Matthew's hands. Having little to do except celebrate Mass and recite his office in the wooden oratory alongside his bungalow below Painswick Beacon, the Metropolitan led an almost eremitical existence. He filled in his days by writing very long letters to his friends, and composed several pamphlets of a controversial nature. In 1924, he published at Stroud a summary of the history, faith, discipline, and aim of the old Roman Catholic Church in Great Britain. This was followed by the English text of the Ordinary of the Mass, translated for the benefit of the 2 or 3 priests who ministered in oratories under his jurisdiction, for there were no ecclesiastical buildings which could be called chapels, far less churches. With that inconsistency which characterized him all his life, at Easter 1925, the Metropolitan issued a new constitution which repudiated the whole historical and doctrinal position of Old Catholicism. It accepted the doctrines of papal infallibility, the Immaculate Conception, and the decrees of the Council of Trent. What he was capable of seeing was that, having made the dogma of papal infallibility necessary for his salvation, he ought to have submitted to the Bishop of Clifton as the Pope's representative in Gloucestershire. What it amounted to was that Monsignor Williams fell back upon the Protestant principle of private judgment. He put his old Roman Catholic Church in much the same position as that of extreme Anglican Papalists. All that differentiated himself and his few clergy from those in communion with the Holy See was that they celebrated the Roman Rite in English instead of in Latin, and that the priests were not bound to celibacy. The immediate result of this new constitution was that a handful of layfolk, under the leadership of a lawyer named Charles David Evans, seceded from the old Roman Catholic Church and set up a new organization which they called the Old Catholic Orthodox Church. They placed themselves under the remote jurisdiction of Monsignor McFall, who regarded himself as Old Catholic Bishop for Ireland and who was not recognized by Monsignor Williams. But McFall never ordained any priest for this tiny sect, so unless its members had recourse to freelance clergy, they had to be satisfied with non-liturgical services. In the early 1930s, however, a Father Francis Finch Stiles, a priest of the Villat Lloyd American Catholic Church, came over to England and ministered to them. This schism in the ranks of the Old Catholic Church, pro-Uniat Rite, was not the only trial which the Metropolitan had to endure. His former auxiliary had been presented with the living of All Saints, Mile End New Town, E1 in 1927, after serving for 7 years as curate of St. Gabriel's, South Bromley. No doubt feeling that his stipend needed augmenting, he started a mail-order chemics business under the name of Howard Barron, with its office in Replingham Road, Southfields, Southwest 18. Unfortunately, the manageress was charged with selling drugs to women to procure abortions. The Anglican vicar and titular Old Catholic Bishop of Durham, as legal proprietor, was sentenced at the Old Bailey on February 10, 1928, to 18 months imprisonment. This widely publicized scandal greatly distressed Monsignor Williams. In December 1928, the Benedictines of Caldy Island moved to Prinish Park, within less than a mile of the Metropolitan's bungalow. The occasional sight of these white-habited monks when out for a walk reminded him of the far-off days when he had tested his vocation with this same community. There was, however, no direct contact between the primate of the old Roman Catholic Church, pro-Uniat Rite, and his Roman Catholic monastic neighbors, although he himself was absolutely convinced that there was no difference in religion, since they both accepted the decrees of the Council of Trent and all subsequent papal dogmatic decisions. The only distinction was that he celebrated Mass in English, and the monks were obliged to use the Latin tongue. On the Feast of Saints Peter and Paul, 1930, Monsignor Williams published a pamphlet entitled A British Uniat Rite, which was a reprint with slight alterations of one issued shortly after the death of Archbishop Matthew in 1919. It was described as suggestions submitted for the consideration of those who, having been born in a country wrenched from Catholic unity by the Reformers, find themselves out of communion with the Holy See through no fault of their own and desire corporate reunion. The author produced what he regarded as conclusive reasons why Catholics should not remain in the Church of England, and gave an idea of the Uniat Church, which he fully expected would soon materialize under his jurisdiction. In October 1934, he summed up his ecclesiastical position as follows: "I am under no illusions whatever as to the Roman Catholic Church, either with regard to its divine or human sides. Generally speaking, Roman Catholics are the most unchristian-like of Christians, and it is this unhappy fact, together with fear of Vatican politics and not the Catholic faith, which makes union between the Holy See and the people of this country impossible, except only by means of a Uniat Church. There are, alas, 10,000 sound reasons why the Anglican Communion can never serve as the base of a Uniat Church. On the other hand, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and other foundation can no man lay that is laid. So, whether we like the human side of things or not, there is nothing else for it if we would save our souls." He informed the same correspondent that from the very first, Dr. Davidson, Archbishop of Canterbury, had made up his mind to destroy the old Roman Catholic Church, and so it was to be feared, had no scruples about the methods used. As to the episcopate of this body, Monsignor Williams was afraid that he was the only legitimate and orthodox bishop left. He added, "If before my death we become convinced that it is the divine will to withdraw the means of building up a Uniat Church for England, which the good God has held out through this movement in the people of this country, we shall of course submit to the Holy See the moment we become so convinced." Years passed, and the eremitical Archbishop of Caerglau remained very much in the background in his retreat on the Cotswolds, still dreaming of the expansion of his rite. In 1939, he published at Gloucester the history and purpose of the old Roman Catholic pro-Uniat rite in Great Britain, in which he tried to explain what to ordinary folk seemed a position of sitting on the fence. He wrote, "We disclaim all pretensions to being in any sense a church. We are simply a rite within the Catholic Church. The pro-Uniat rite is the lineal descendant of the ancient Church of Britain. Among her saintly founders, she numbers St. Egbert of Northumbria, who sent St. Willibrord and his 11 companions to evangelize the Cati, Batavi, and Frisians. The rite had survived in the Netherlands for 1300 years, whence it had been reintroduced in England by Bishop Matthew in 1908. That there is both necessity and room for a British Uniat rite is only too clearly proved by the unhappy fact that notwithstanding the increase in the number of Christians, religious houses, and clergy, the Latin rite will never bring England back to the faith and to Catholic unity. It will never be more than tolerated in this country. It will never be liked, and the people will never take it to their hearts, and it will continue to repel the many who are attracted by the little they have somehow managed to learn of the true faith." These statements imply that Mass was celebrated in Anglo-Saxon by the monks of Ripon in the 7th century, and that this vernacular liturgy was introduced into Frisia by St. Willibrord about 678. The implication that this rite was adopted at Utrecht 6 years later when the see was founded, and somehow or other managed to survive until 1908, when Bishop Matthew brought it back to England, is a delightful fantasy. To Monsignor Williams and his half a dozen priests, it seemed true that they were the canonical successors in the 20th century of Willibrord, Swithbert, the two Ewelds, Lawrence, and other Northumbrian monk missionaries, and that they celebrated Mass according to the same rite as that used by them in Frisia, Westphalia, and the Rhineland, a rite far superior to the Missal Romanum of St. Pius V, obligatory on all bishops and secular priests in Britain who are in communion with the Holy See. The Metropolitan continued in the same strain. The pro-Uniat rite has its roots deeply embedded in our native land. It is not a modern importation, as are the non-Catholic religions, the progenitors of which arrived in this country in Tudor times. It has never broken Catholic unity, and therefore has not within it the seeds of disunion which must lead to the production and multiplication of sects. In this most important particular, the old Roman Catholic pro-Uniat rite stands alone, and it is therefore the only means in this country, except the Latin rite, which is capable of bringing about a real and lasting union among Christians. The truth of this fact is most clearly demonstrated by the tremendous opposition which the pro-Uniat rite has had to endure at the forces of disunion, the measure of persecution to which it has been subjected. It is difficult to grasp the workings of the metropolitan mind when he proceeded to forbid his clergy to use any liturgical books which did not contain the nihil obstat and imprimatur of a bishop in communion with the Holy See. English missals, rituals, breviaries, diurnals, etc., published by Anglo-Catholic firms were not allowed, however closely they conformed to Roman Catholic originals. An enthusiastic defender of the pro-Uniat rite was found in the Reverend George Aubrey St. John Seeley, who was ordained priest by Monsignor Williams in 1940, and ministered in the oratory at Devonshire Lodge, 15 Marylebone Road, London, for 4 years. He expounded its virtues in a printed leaflet, and says it offers freedom from ultramontane and state domination and international politics. He stressed that, unlike the C of E, the ORCC was entirely without views, schools of thought, higher criticism, or modernism, for it professes the old faith in its integrity and entirety. The controversy over the Church of South India, which had started in 1930 when the Lambeth Conference gave general encouragement in its projection, reached its peak when this new body was finally inaugurated in September 1947. It appears that Williams had been persuaded by at least one of his clergy that at long last many Anglo-Catholic priests and layfolk would realize that the only refuge for those who wished to keep their faith intact was the pro-Uniat rite. It is possible that the expected stampede of Anglicans into this fold at no distant date may have moved the Archbishop of Caerglow to ordain 4 more priests in the Marylebone Oratory in 1947. One of them, Wilfred Andrew Barrington Evans, was the son of a Baptist deacon, his mother being an Anglican. Brought up in the Church of England, he became a devout church worker, eventually holding licenses as a reader in the Diocese of London, Oxford, and Southwark. He married in 1922 and earned his living in a London bank. In January 1947, he informed Dr. Wand, Bishop of London, that he and several friends had decided to secede from communion with Canterbury to that of Caerglow and returned his reader's license. 2 months later, he was ordained deacon and priest by Archbishop Williams and placed in charge of the pro-Uniat Rite Chapel in Marylebone. Not long after this, he opened a chapel at West Drayton, Middlesex, where he resided with his wife and family, feeling that many persons would appreciate the pro-Uniat Rite as an alternative to the Latin Rite, which had been celebrated in the Church of St. Catherine the Martyr since it was dedicated by Cardinal Manning on September 30th, 1869. Father Barrington Evans founded and edited a diocesan chronicle, the first issue of which appeared in 1947. The following year, a second pro-Uniat place of worship was opened in West Kensington, removing the following May to a house in Park Crescent, Regent's Park, not far from the oratory at Devonshire House, which was closed down. There was, however, no noticeable decrease in the congregations at All Saints, Margaret Street, St. Cyprian, Clarence Gate, St. Mary Magdalene's, Munster Square, or at any of the other Anglo-Catholic churches in the neighborhood, as the result of this pro-Uniat invasion of Marylebone, led by the Archbishop of Caerglow and his little army. Neither did the Roman Catholic clergy at Our Lady of the Rosary, Marylebone Road, St. James, Spanish Place, or St. Charles, Ogle Street, find that the faithful were being lured away from the Latin Rite by the attraction of a vernacular liturgy. It is impossible not to form the impression that the half-dozen or dozen priests under the jurisdiction of Monsignor Williams were so taken up with debating among themselves that they had little time for pastoral work. The Metropolitan presided over a synod which was held at West Drayton on October 20th, 1947, exactly a month after the formation of the Church of South India. He expressed the hope that the reunion would mark the beginning of a new era for the pro-Uniat Rite in Britain. Many alleged serious errors in H.R.T. Brandreth's recently published Episcopi Vagantes and the Anglican Church had been detected and were discussed in camera. It was resolved to send to every bishop of the worldwide Anglican Communion an open letter addressed to Dr. Fisher, the primate of all England. This document was drawn up, and the hierarchies of the respective provinces were politely requested to leave the pro-Uniat Rite alone. The Archbishop and his clergy felt that the bitter persecution to which they had been subjected by the authorities of the Church of England since the days of Dr. Randall Davidson must cease. A renewed pledge was given that there would be no more conditional reordinations of Anglican clergymen, however hard they might plead for the validation of their orders in the hope of feeling themselves at last real priests. The next issue of the Diocesan Chronicle featured an urgent appeal for vocations to the priesthood. England, Wales, and Scotland were waiting to be converted to pro-Uniatism. The harvest indeed was great, but the laborers few. Assurances were given that in the event of the death of Monsignor Williams, without consecrating a successor, consecration from an American source had been guaranteed. The Metropolitan hinted that this might not be necessary, because a certain French coadjutor bishop, whose name could not be disclosed, had promised to supply the pro-Uniat Rite with a bishop so long as the consecration was kept secret. In some respects, Archbishop Williams was quite as unpredictable as Arnold Harris Matthew. In inconsistency, at least, he perpetuated the Matthew tradition for over 30 years. So far as can be made out, he virtually closed down the church in 1920, but reopened it again 4 years later when he completely broke with the continental Old Catholics by making papal infallibility an article of faith and accepting the decrees of the Council of Trent. This action on his part repudiated the Union of Utrecht. He ordained at least one priest in 1930, but 4 years later almost made up his mind to submit to the Holy See. After this, he shut the doors again until the 40s, when he had visions of spreading the pro-Uniat right, sanguine that the Roman authorities would realize that the conversion of England would be achieved only by setting up a Uniat body with a vernacular liturgy. The truth is that Williams was a hermit living in a dream world, more at home in romance than in reality. Typically, he was an ardent Jacobite and a fervent believer in legitimacy. In his domestic oratory, he used to pray publicly every Sunday after Mass for Otto our Emperor and Rupert our King, holding Prince Rupert of Bavaria as the jour divino foreign of Great Britain and Ireland. Every year on May 29th, he used to pin oak leaves on his biretta, soutane, and chasuble to commemorate the restoration of the Stuart dynasty, but presumably not the restoration of the Church of England. It gave him immense satisfaction that through his mother he could claim descent from Malcolm III and St. Margaret, Queen of Scotland, also less illustrious links with the Dukes of Buckingham in the 17th century. But his greatest pride was in having a maternal ancestor who was out for the king in the 15 who lost everything for his loyalty, yet sent his son to the 45. The bones of this Jacobite forebear lay in the Well of the Dead on Culloden Moor. "We have never compromised our loyalty," Williams wrote to a fellow Jacobite on Oak Apple Day 1942. "We have never worshipped the rising, now setting sun. I do not recognize any law in this country passed since December 1688 as binding in the form of conscience." He liked to boast that he must have been alone in Britain when he celebrated a public requiem mass for his sacred and imperial majesty the Emperor Francis Joseph at the time of his death in 1916 during the First World War. The Archbishop of Caerglo kept up a ceaseless correspondence with other Jacobites and Legitimists, and stated that he would have been only too glad if the Bavarian prince would have driven the Hanoverian usurper off the throne of Britain. "I never admit defeat," he explained. "Oh yes, it all looks impossible enough, but everything worthwhile has always been impossible, and it is so often the impossible that happens. The way to bring back the king is to make ourselves worthy of it, and God would do the rest. As things have been and are, it is fitting that we should be misruled by servants. In fact, the vegetarian, eremitical, Jacobite, legitimist prelate was always sponsoring lost causes. At the same time, he was utterly convinced that he was the innocent victim of ceaseless and sinister persecutions for his religious and political opinions. The situation went from bad to worse, and the affairs of the pro-Uniat right more and more chaotic. In November 1948, a synod was held at the archiepiscopal bungalow, where the metropolitan announced that he had decided to consecrate Canon Matthew, not with the right of succession, but merely to hold the episcopate. Later, he proposed that Father Barrington Evans should be made archdeacon, announcing that he, and not Canon Matthew, would in the event of his death be responsible for the administration of the rite, in the presumption that the clergy would elect a bishop whom Canon Matthew would then consecrate. By the following March, Monsignor Williams had changed his mind again. Matthew was not to be raised to the episcopate, or Barrington Evans appointed as archdeacon. The priests hardly knew from day to day what new ideas would occur to the Archbishop of Caerglo. Meanwhile, he was writing a supplement to his diocesan chronicle, which appeared in May 1949. Most of its 4 pages were devoted to correcting errors said to have been discovered in the recently published book by Dr. C.B. Moss, entitled The Old Catholic Movement. At the same time, the Metropolitan took the chance to dismiss the Anglican Communion as the creation of the foreign Protestant reformers under Elizabeth, her minister Cecil, and his church-despoiling friends. Nothing, not even all the chasubles in the world, can charge the fact that the Anglican Communion is an essentially purely Protestant foundation. Secondly, from her foundation until now, she has suffered from a complete lack of order of any sort or kind, as is proved approved by the writings of her founders, who did not believe in the necessity of ordination. Thirdly, because of the rampant heresy within the Anglican Communion, even the Catholic-minded party is permeated with modernism, which she is powerless to restrain or repress, even if her authorities were inclined, or dared to attempt to do so. Can the cause of God be served by such means? Could a Uniate Church be built upon such a foundation? Surely not. Having expressed his mind to Dr. Woodward, the Bishop of Gloucester, the Archbishop of Caerglow tried to assure the newly appointed Bishop of Clifton, Monsignor Joseph E. Rudderham, within whose diocese he resided, that the pro-Uniate Rite attempted the one true faith of Jesus Christ precisely as it is defined by the infallible authority of the Holy See. We condemn every heresy, without exception, which the Holy See has condemned. We detest all schism, and in the words of Wilbrord van Os, Old Catholic Archbishop of Utrecht, 1814 through 1825, we have never broken the sacred bond of Catholic unity, or made common cause with any who, having done so, remain in schism. Moreover, and this is a very important point, we have proved that the Rite is capable of stability. Since the defection of the ancient Church of Utrecht, this Rite remains the sole lineal descendant, representative and heir indeed, all that remains of the ancient British, Anglo-Saxon, and medieval English churches, and our roots have been embedded in our native soil from the earliest days of Christianity. It is not our purpose to provide a resting place for disgruntled Latin Catholics whom we refuse to receive, or for ritualists and cranks from elsewhere. Our mission is to those who, for one or other of many reasons, remain uninfluenced by the Latin Rite. Our mission is that which no other religious organization is able to offer, namely, to provide all the advantages of a Uniate Rite, except as yet our actual constitution as such by the Holy See. As the old Catholic churches of Holland, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, the Polish National Catholic Church in America, and in fact every other schismatic body not in communion with the Holy See, claiming valid orders from the Ferret, Velat, Matthew, Hereford, and other lines of succession, they were dismissed with a stroke of the Metropolitan's pen. He was apparently incapable of realizing that if average Roman Catholics had even heard of his beloved pro-Uniate Rite, they would certainly regard it as merely a tiny sect, founded by an apostate priest who, having been married by an Anglican incumbent, was consecrated as bishop in a schismatic church, from which he subsequently broke away and died with a major excommunication from the Holy See still hanging over him. While the charred chimes at Prentish Abbey down the road echoed through the bungalow windows night and day as a reminder that the pro-Uniate Rite was still a long way from being recognized by the Holy See, the Archbishop of Caerglow went on seeing visions, planning and organizing in his dream world. Early in 1950, for no apparent reason, he suddenly turned down a man who was due to be ordained subdeacon. Then he informed Father Barrington Evans that he was seriously considering closing down the Rite for good and all. To add to his worries, two of his priests, G.A. St. John Seeley and G.P.T. Paget King, whom he had expelled and deposed from orders on January 31, 1948, had set up a body of their own, which they called the English Old Roman Catholic Rite. Events on both sides of the Atlantic, together with the Archbishop's refusal in July 1950 to consider any arrangements to ensure the continuation of the pro-Uniate Rite in the event of his death, led to much grumbling and discussion among his priests as to what action they should take. However, a month later, the Metropolitan appeared to be more optimistic of the future and was prepared to talk about ordaining some more priests. Then, without warning, he announced that he would perform no further episcopal functions and ordered his clergy to stop celebrating Mass, except privately for their own devotion. They felt that they could not obey him, and after an exchange of letters, decided that the future of their pastoral work involves severance of all relations with the Metropolitan. On September 22, 1950, a declaration was signed in London, repudiating the jurisdiction of the Archbishop of Caerglow, who found himself with only two priests, Canon Matthew and Father Bennett. both of whom appear to have been in sympathy with the rebels under the leadership of Father Barrington Evans, though declining to join them out of respect to the oaths of canonical obedience which they had taken to Monsignor Williams. In a sense, it was the story of Arnold Harris Matthew over again, for he too had been abandoned by all but one of his priests in 1915. As to going over to Rome, this was out of the question. Writing to the Reverend W. H. Duval on September 24, 1951, Monsignor Williams explained, "All the popes since Pius IX have been socialists, except Benedict XV, the only gentleman among them. I could never submit to a socialist pope, but if we had a sound pope, and I could have received on the terms of the pacification of Clement IX, then I would have taken the course before now, but that remains the only course I could take. I cannot believe that Almighty God requires me to take an oath I well know to be false in order to save my soul. That is what the present position amounts to, and well the authorities know it." Indeed, it was a tragic situation. Not only did the Archbishop of Caerglo found it impossible to submit to the Patriarch of the West, for various reasons he did not see his way to submit to any of the patriarchs of the dissident Eastern churches, Orthodox, Nestorian, and Monophysite. He refused to consider seeking communion with the bishops of the Anglican provinces of Canterbury and York. He regarded with horror all the archbishops and bishops of the Ferret and Valois lines of succession who were functioning in England. They were dismissed as heretics as well as schismatics. Even greater was his detestation of his rivals in the Matthew line of succession, because none of them accepted his authority. Lastly, he could not picture himself as a prelate of the eparchy of all the Britons in the Catholicate of the West, paying allegiance to Mar Georges, Patriarch of Glastonbury. The truth was that in the end he became convinced that he was the only real Catholic and Orthodox bishop in Britain. Bernard Mary Williams died on June 9, 1952, after an illness lasting from the previous Easter. It is fairly certain that he wished his pro-uniat right to come to an end, and it is said that before his death he wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster to this effect. He was buried in the churchyard at Frethern, Gloucestershire, after a requiem mass had been celebrated in the little wooden oratory at Madam's Wood. None of the three priests who had remained loyal to Monsignor Williams felt that they were justified in carrying out his last wishes by dissolving the pro-uniat rite, and they continued to operate under the title of the Old Roman Catholic Church. To add to the complex situation, Mar Georges, Patriarch of Glastonbury, claimed that if there was a legitimate successor to the Archbishop of Caerglo, it was himself, because his succession was derived from Archbishop Matthew by way of Archbishop de Ortega Maxi, Patriarch of Malaga, who derived his orders in one line from the Prince de Landes. None of the 6 other bishops previously consecrated by Matthew had left a succession, so in the opinion of Mar Georges, the jurisdiction was canonically vested in the senior line derived from the original repository of the jurisdiction. Neither the loyal remnant of 3 priests, nor Father Barrington Evans, the head of the schismatic body, were prepared to accept the somewhat complex arguments put forward by the Patriarch of Glastonbury. Shortly before his death, but after the formation of the schismatic body, one of the 2 priests who had been deposed and excommunicated in 1948, Father Paget King, was reconciled with his former metropolitan and was with him during the last illness. Sometime after the funeral, arguments were made for Paget King's consecration by a bishop of the North American Old Roman Catholic Church, Gerard G. Shelley, but the negotiations broke down. Eventually it was decided that as Bishop Shelley was likely to remain indefinitely in Europe, with his headquarters in Rome, there he was employed as a translator by UNESCO. The tiny remnant of the original pro-uniat rite in Britain did not really need a resident bishop. So it was that Monsignor Shelley became the successor of Monsignor Williams and took the right of Archbishop of Caerglo. It was quite in keeping with late medieval precedent that the primate of this branch of the Old Roman Catholic Church should reside several thousands of miles from Caerglo in Wales, with his headquarters outside the walls of Vatican City. Father Paget King was appointed Vicar General, and the curial offices were established at Steenaven Mission House, 16 Aberdeen Road, Highbury, London, N5. On August 12, 1957, the second Archbishop of Caerglo issued an encyclical letter from Rome addressed to the bishops, clergy, and laity under his jurisdiction. He stated that in view of the many unauthorized persons still making claims to be old Roman Catholic prelates, the only bishops he recognized were Richard A. Marchena, USA, Sigismund Vapartus, USA, George T. Kerner, USA, Hans Huer, otherwise known as Bishop Willibrord, resident in Germany, and Jose P. Ortiz, Mexico. On Whit Sunday, 1960, Monsignor Shelley, assisted by Bishop Willibrord, consecrated his Vicar General, Geoffrey P.T. Paget King, as Coadjutor Bishop for England of the Old Roman Catholic Church. The ceremony took place in the chapel of St. Thomas of Canterbury at Steenhaven House, one of a long row of houses in a drab terrace hidden away to the east side of Highbury Grove, a remote part of North London, now much favored as a place of residence by members of the Victorian Society. At the time of writing, the only other places of worship in Britain maintained by this small body are chapels at Brixton, London, South-West, and Tonbridge, Kent. There have been several defections among its few clergy, and vocations are badly needed. On February 23, 1962, by the unanimous decision of the Synod of the Primatical See of Caerglo, and with the approval and consent of the Episcopal Synod in the USA, a revised edition of the constitutions and rules of what is called the whole canonical Old Roman Catholic Church in every country was published. It is laid down that the only authorized liturgical books are those of the Latin Rite, known as the Rituale Romanum, the Missale Romanum, and the Pontificale Romanum, in accurate and authorized translations, and in any supplements to any of these, or books which may at any time be authorized for use by Old Roman Catholics by the authority of the primate. It is also laid down that in conformity with the universal rule of the Catholic Church, no cleric having been ordained to the subdiaconate may thereafter contract matrimony. In accordance with Eastern custom, married men may be ordained, subject always to the approval of the spouse. No man who has been married twice may be ordained. No married man may be elected to the episcopate unless his wife has previously died. These regulations on matrimony differentiate this body from almost all the others dealt with in this book. On January 1, 1963, Bishop Paget King, coadjutor to the primate, issued an official statement that Archbishop Marchena and the Old Roman Catholic Church in North America had, by its own free act and will, separated itself from communion with the canonical Old Roman Catholic Church, explaining that all the bishops, clergy, and laity had returned to the irregular and uncanonical status in which they were from 1942 to 1957. 2. Old Catholic Church in Ireland. Archbishop Matthew's second spiritual child did not have a very long life and never attracted much publicity, for it existed mainly in the Celtic imagination of its founder, James McFall. His conception of Catholicity was always nebulous and eclectic. From his youth, his absorbing interest had been religious ceremonial. Early in 1905, he came over from Ireland and stayed with the Anglican Benedictine monks at Painsthorpe in Yorkshire. On his return to Belfast, he wrote an article printed in the Catholic Times, hardly able to find words in which to express his enthusiasm for the perfection of the singing, the splendor of the liturgical functions, and the magnificent vestments. By way of showing his admiration for these Church of England monks, the Irish Roman Catholic layman presented Abbot Alred Carlisle with a wooden crozier and prayer desk carved by himself. 5 years later, McFall, having seceded from communion with the Holy See, found himself a priest of the Old Roman Catholic Church. 6 years after this, he was in the happy state of not only selling mitres and other pontifical vestments, but of donning them himself. Shortly after his consecration, he was solemnly excommunicated by Matthew. There is a story that he refused to perform any episcopal acts in Ireland for many years, owing to a promise made to Cardinal Log, Archbishop of Armagh, and we are told that apparently the cardinal did not mind much what James did as long as it was not within his jurisdiction, for all his activities were mainly in England, though he did once visit the Channel Islands. It must be admitted that he was a man of no great education, though in many ways knowledgeable, particularly in relation to pre-Reformation monastic matters. As stated already, in April 1925, Bishop McFall found himself the nominal head of a schism from the old Roman Catholic Church in England, which styled itself the Old Catholic Orthodox Church. Under the leadership of W.C.D. Evans, a number of lay people dissociated themselves from Monsignor Williams when he became a militant papalist. Relations between McFall and Williams became even more strained after the latter proclaimed that he did not rule over a church, and that his followers were merely a rite within the Catholic Church. The Archbishop of Caerglo always seems to have resented the presence of a more or less freelance bishop in Ireland, whose instrument of consecration he had witnessed. As late as October 27, 1947, he felt it his duty to inform Dr. Fisher, Archbishop of Canterbury, that McFall was not recognized by the pro-Uniat Rite, since it had not been canonically erected in Ireland. In the winter of 1933, Monsignor McFall defied the authority of the Archbishop of Caerglo, the Bishop of Brentwood, and the Bishop of Chelmsford by performing another episcopal action within an area which each of them regarded as under his jurisdiction. On December 21st, he consecrated the Reverend Thomas R. Coatbridge Williams, Ph.D., who had succeeded Bishop Beale as rector of Great Sutton, a village among the marshlands at the upper end of the River Road in Essex. It is possible that this consecration was connected in some way with the revived order of corporate reunion, or with a wish to make sure of the maintenance of the Matthew line of succession. Although the ceremony is recorded as having taken place in public, it was not until January 1940 that Dr. Wilson, Bishop of Chelmsford, admitted that he had heard of it. The Regionary Bishop of the Old Catholic Church in Ireland, whose conception of jurisdiction was even more elusive than that of the bishops of the Celtic Church, made another trip to England in the autumn of 1938, when he gave minor and major orders up to the priesthood to Hugh George de Wilmot Newman on October 23rd. No sooner had he returned to Belfast than he released the newly ordained priest from his jurisdiction and forgot all about him. This happy-go-lucky Irish prelate died in 1960, still running a church furnishing shop in Belfast, under the name of his daughter, Miss Columba McFall. On more than one occasion when he was in Britain, he enjoyed the hospitality of the now Roman Catholic Benedictine monks, first on Caldy Island and later at Prinish, whose ritual and ceremonial had so thrilled him when he was their guest at Painsthorpe in 1905. It has been said he used to proclaim that he was always a Roman Catholic, who happened only accidentally to be out of communion with the Holy See. This is precisely what Matthew had insisted on during his cross-examination by F. E. Smith. Both prelates had a limitless capacity for self-defensive delusions. 3. The Liberal Catholic Church. By the summer of 1915, the majority of the clergy serving the old Roman Catholic Church had become members of the Theosophical Society and the Order of the Star in the East. It gave them a shock when Archbishop Matthew ordered them to resign their membership of these organizations in his pastoral letter, promulgated on August 6 that year. They had plenty of reasons to regard their metropolitan as obscurantist, unenlightened, and behind the times. Even after nearly half a century, no Anglican bishop has felt it necessary to denounce clergy tainted with the same heresies. Mrs. Besant wrote in October 1911, "Theosophy is spreading much among the clergy of the English Church and the ministers of the nonconformist communities. Not only have we members of the Theosophical Society among the clergy, but there is an increasing number who welcome sermons on theosophical writings, and many more who themselves teach a mysticism undistinguishable from theosophy." The statement was perfectly true. For 12 years after the publication in 1899 of Christian Mysticism by William R. Ing, then Vicar of All Saints, Knightsbridge, there had been a spat of books on the spiritual life, not all of them orthodox, culminating with Evelyn Underhill's Mysticism and Her Path of Eternal Wisdom, both published in 1911. It became fashionable to regard oneself both as a mystic and a modernist, which often involved becoming a vegetarian as well. As alternatives, there were Mrs. Mary Baker Eddy's so-called Christian Science, or the New Thought movement and spiritualism, all of which offered a kind of religion less mundane than that supplied by conventional Anglicanism. Among the Church of England clergy who were openly expounding theosophical doctrines from their pulpits in the first decade of this century was the Reverend W. F. Geikie Cobb, who at St. Ethelburga's Bishopsgate in the heart of the City of London combined them with the richest of Anglo-Catholic ceremonial, and at the same time defied the Bishop of London by remarrying divorced persons. He had previously been Assistant Secretary of the English Church Union. Even the Benedictine Library on Caldy Island accumulated at this period a large miscellaneous selection of books and pamphlets dealing with theosophy, Rosicrucianism, reincarnation, and similar forms of non-Christian mysticism. The Reverend L. W. Fern, a curate of St. John's, Westminster, and warden of the Church Mystical Union, attracted large congregations by his exposition of the teachings of the Reverend Holden E. Sampson, as set forth in his Life of the Lord Jesus Christ, the Great Master of the Cross and Serpent, and Progressive Redemption, both of which were based on theosophy and accepted the doctrine of reincarnation. The Reverend C. W. Scott Moncrief, father of the well-known Scottish Roman Catholic author, was an enthusiastic member of the Order of the Star of the East. Under the name of a Christian theosophist, he tried to be an early 20th century John the Baptist, preparing the way for the advent of Krishnamurti as the reincarnation of Christ. Many other Anglican clergymen had absorbed the pseudo-mysticism propagated by Mrs. Besant and leading members of the Theosophical Society without actually joining it, so it really was a little hard that Archbishop Matthew should take such a strong line when the bishops of the Church of England were lying low. The half-dozen priests of the old Roman Catholic Church lost no time in rallying their forces after the promulgation of their Metropolitan's Pastoral on August 8, 1915. Within 5 weeks they had elected 2 of their members to the episcopate. On September 26, the deposed Bishop of St. Pancras, Frederick Samuel Willoughby, consecrated Bernard Edward Rupert Gauntlet and Robert King. This double consecration was intended as a gesture of defiance of Archbishop Matthew in view of what was held to be an unjustified exercise of authority. Both these clerics had been ordained by Matthew. The former, an ex-Irvingite, was secretary of the Theosophical Society Order of Healers, and had already been given the rank of canon. The latter was a consulting psychic and advertised careful character delineation, aptitudes, and other particulars from birth horoscopes by a practitioner skilled in the true Placidian method. His charge for supplying such occult information was 10 shillings, 6 ducats, or $2.60. The real leader of this schism from the Matthew-founded church was James Ingle Wedgwood, and it was mainly due to his remarkable personality that it finally extended its activities to every continent. He was born in 1883, and it has been said that his mother was a natural clairvoyant. As a youth, he became an Anglo-Catholic and was associated with the underground affairs of the moribund remnant of the Order of Corporate Reunion. He joined the Confraternity of the Blessed Sacrament and most other Anglo-Catholic organizations of the same character. Having left school, he worked as an analytical chemist at York. Feeling convinced that he had a vocation to the priesthood, he lodged with the Reverend Patrick Shaw, the newly appointed rector of All Saints, North Street, York. This ancient church, with its famous late medieval stained glass, ornate ritual and ceremonial, satisfied all his religious and artistic instincts. In his spare time, he took lessons from the organist of the minster. A friend who knew Wedgwood about the age of 20 recalled him as a cultured and intelligent young man, dark-eyed, good-looking, and attractive in manner. One day Mrs. Besant gave a lecture at York. Wedgwood was instantly converted to theosophy by her convincing arguments. He informed Father Shaw, who, though a most kindly man, was so horrified that he banished his lodger from the rectory. The Anglican Benedictine monks at Painsthorpe, 14 miles east of York, were more tolerant, especially Abbot Albert Carlyle, who throughout his long life took a keen interest in all forms of occultism and never ceased to believe privately in the existence of the astral body. Wedgwood stayed at the monastery and lent the abbot theosophical books and pamphlets. The latter, however, was critical of their fundamental content and told his young friend that Catholic mysticism offered everything provided by theosophy, but on sounder lines. Mrs. Besant's new convert bade farewell to the Anglican Benedictines and moved to London, where he became an active worker for the Theosophical Society. From 1911 to 1913, he acted as General Secretary of its English section. In spite of his absorption in Theosophy, Wedgwood still regarded himself as an Anglo-Catholic and had not ceased to yearn for the priesthood. Early in 1913, he wrote to Archbishop Matthew for details of his sect, which at that date was known as the Ancient Catholic Church of Great Britain. He had been told that, unlike the Anglican and Roman Catholic churches, the constitution of this new body made room for the free development of the individual conscience in relation to modern scientific discoveries and occult research, and that its worship retained all the traditional richness of the Western Church, to which he had been so attracted since boyhood. Having received a friendly reply from the Archbishop, he showed him a copy of Mrs. Besant's Theosophy as representing his own beliefs. It appears that no difficulties were raised about his admission to Matthew's little flock. Wedgwood, for his part, had no scruples about signing the declaration by which he was formally united with the ancient Catholic Church of England, Scotland, and Ireland, thus professing the faith in the decrees of the seven holy ecumenical councils, as laid down in precise terms in the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed of the Universal Church, the holy sacrifice of the Mass, the dogma of transubstantiation, the seven sacraments, and the decrees of the Synod of Jerusalem, 1672. Wedgwood was so elastic mentally that he managed to combine these traditional doctrines with co-Masonry, Rosicrucianism, and Theosophy. Matthew lost no time in giving him conditional baptism and confirmation, then followed rapidly the four minor orders, subdiaconate and diaconate. Apparently his knowledge of Theosophy needed no testing, for on July 22, 1913, he was raised to the priesthood. The Roman rite was used at all the ceremonies. Before long, the Secretary of the Supreme Council of Universal Co-Freemasonry in the British Empire was able to wear the robes of a canon beneath his regalia. 3 years elapsed, however, before Canon Wedgwood was raised to the high priesthood of the new completely theosophical Old Roman Catholic Church. The function took place in the Co-Masonic Temple, 13 Bloomfield Road, Maida Vale, London West, 9. Because the public oratory normally used for each ceremonies would not have held the crowds expected, in the imposing Latin Instrumentum Consecrationis, it was stated that on February 23rd, the sixth Sunday after Epiphany, 1916, the most illustrious and most reverend Lord Frederick Samuel Willoughby, Master of Arts of St. Catherine's College, Cambridge, by the grace of God Catholic Bishop, formerly titular Bishop of St. Pancras, assisted by the most illustrious lords, Robert King and Bernard Edmund Gauntlet, Catholic bishops of the region of Britain, consecrated the Right Reverend Lord James Ingle Wedgwood, priest of the Catholic Church and canon of the Metropolitan Cathedral. Once more the Roman Rite, as adapted and translated in the 1909 Old Catholic Missal and Ritual, was followed. Affixed to the document were the signatures of the consecrator and co-consecrators, Canons Carter and Ferrer, Father Theodore Bell, and 23 layfolk, most of them well-known theosophists. Leaving the psychic Bishop King in charge of the Old Roman Catholic Church, Bishop Wedgwood sailed for Australia, and on July 22, 1916, conferred the episcopate on Charles Webster Leadbeater at Sydney, New South Wales. Leadbeater's career had been full of strange adventures. His boyhood and youth were spent in South America, where on one occasion he was kidnapped and nearly murdered by savages. Returning to England, he was ordained deacon and priest at Farnham by Dr. Harold Brown, Bishop of Winchester, in 1879. While serving a curacy at Bramshot, Hants, he met Madame Blavatsky and was converted to Theosophy. From 1885 to 1893, he spent most of his time in Ceylon in India, absorbed in the study of Buddhism. He was a man of considerable learning in many subjects, and there is no doubt that he possessed unusual gifts as a clairvoyant. In 1906, Leadbeater was forced to resign the secretaryship of the Theosophical Society when charged with crimes of sexual perversion. conversion. He maintained that this was the ordeal he had to undergo as the symbolical crucifixion through which all candidates for the Arhat, the fourth stage in Theosophist initiation, must pass. The storm blew over by 1919, and he was invited by Mrs. Besant to rejoin the society. He went to Australia in 1913 and remained there for the rest of his life. He describes his consecration in a letter to Mrs. Besant. Wedgwood has arrived and is in good health. His consecration to the episcopate has had the unexpected result of putting him practically at the head of the old Catholic movement, so far as the British Empire is concerned. All his colleagues, except I think one, in it being Theosophists, ready to work under his direction. This being so, he desires most earnestly to offer the movement to the world teacher as one of the vehicles for his force and a channel for the preparation of his coming. I took him therefore to the Lord Maitreya at the festival, a Sala occult festival, and he was graciously pleased to accept the offer and to say that he thought the movement would fill a niche in the scheme and would be useful to him. From what he said, I inferred that he himself had so guided events as to produce this curious result, that a branch of the Catholic Church, having the apostolic succession in a form which cannot be questioned, should be entirely in the hands of the Theosophists, who are eager and willing to do exactly as he wishes. With his permission, the Lord Maitreya, Wedgwood has consecrated me as a bishop, on the understanding that I am at perfect liberty to wear my ordinary dress, and am in no way bound to perform any ecclesiastical ceremonies, or take any outward part in the work unless I see it useful to do so, but to act as an intermediary between the Lord and this branch of his church. Bishop Leadbeater also felt it worthwhile to tell Mrs. Besant that his own master had come to him in the night and said to him, "You thought you had given up all prospects of a bishopric when you left your church 30 years ago to follow Upasika, Madame Blavatsky, but I may tell you that it would have been in this very year that you would have reached it if you had remained in your original work. So you have lost nothing except the emoluments and the social position, and have gained enormously in other ways. No one ever loses by serving us." During the next 13 years, the Theosophists found more than enough omens and portents to convince them that the old Roman Catholics in England had lost nothing by breaking away from Archbishop Matthew in order to serve the Lord Maitreya and the other masters. On the contrary, they had gained both materially and spiritually. After Leadbeater's consecration, which was carried out according to the Roman rite, the two bishops decided that a new liturgy was needed. They agreed that it should conform to the traditional model of the Western Church as closely as possible. The work of revision took over 3 years. Filled with zeal to serve the Lord Maitreya, Bishop Wedgwood left Australia for New Zealand, where he preached the theosophical version of Old Catholicism. He made many converts and ordained several priests. On his return to Sydney, assisted by Leadbeater, he consecrated the Jonker Julian Adrian Mazel as auxiliary bishop for Australia on the feast of St. John the Baptist, June 24, 1917. This was the last occasion that Matthew's Old Catholic Missal and ritual was used by the Theosophical branch of his church. It was in March 1917 that the editor of Theosophy in Australia interviewed Bishop Leadbeater. In reply to a question about the world teacher, the Lord Maitreya, using the Old Catholic movement as the nucleus of his new presentation of Christianity, Leadbeater said, "At any rate, it is there for him if he wishes to use it. There will be a great outrush of force when he comes, and many thousands will gather around him. Among those there are sure to be some who love his older church and its ritual, and the old Catholic Church might well afford a convenient resting place for them. Unhappily, it seems by no means certain that the great churches of the present day will be prepared to recognize and receive him, but at least this branch will know him and work for him, putting itself wholly into his hands as an instrument to be used at his will." The reports of what was going on in Australia and New Zealand greatly worried Archbishop Matthew. On February 17, 1916, he had written to Canon Ferrer, telling him that, like the rest of the old Roman Catholic clergy, he had been a very naughty, disobedient boy. He said that if Mrs. Besant wished to save her immortal soul, she must be obedient to the voice of God's church, and then ask our Lord to give her a true vocation to a religious life, in which by the repression of her will and life of obedience and self-annihilation, she would be able to expiate the sins of the past. Mrs. Besant might well have replied that she was already obeying the orders of the Lord Maitreya, imparted to her on the astral plane. Matthew had heard rumors that Wedgwood was going to Chicago to get reconsecrated by Villot, but he did not venture to express an opinion whether Mar Timotheus was a real bishop. He ended this long letter with the words, "You are all very headstrong, wayward young men, who believe very much in your own infallibility, though you cannot accept that of the Pope." Bishop Wedgwood then set off on a round-the-world tour to prepare the way for the coming of the Lord Maitreya. Sailing from Australia, his voice was soon crying in the wilderness of Los Angeles, Hollywood, Vancouver, Chicago, New York, and other large towns and cities of the United States and Canada. He made many converts and ordained several priests before arriving back in England in the late autumn of 1917. In December that same year, he summoned an episcopal and clerical synod in London, where he was able to give glowing reports of his missionary labors. In view of the recent attacks made by the Dutch Old Catholics, it was resolved to give the Theosophical section of the Church the official title of the Liberal Christian Church, Old Catholic. In the first months of 1918, Wedgwood gave his imprimatur to a small liturgical book containing a new version of the Roman Mass in the vernacular, also Vespers and Benediction. It was issued for use in the churches of our movement in the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and America. In North America, Bishop Wedgwood was sure that the Lord Maitreya would find countless devoted disciples wanting to receive him when he chose to appear in the body of Krishnamurti. In 1918, the Reverend Charles Hampton had published at Hollywood a pamphlet in which he urged members of the Order of the Star in the East to support the Old Catholic Church. He reminded his readers that the Old Catholic Church had been highly recommended by our great protector, Mrs. Besant, whose far-seeing eyes discerned in it one of the movements overshadowed by the Lord Maitreya to improve the religious development of the Western world. Regarding himself as the 20th century St. Paul, carrying a daily burden, the care of all the churches, but fortified by the knowledge that he was the chosen messenger of the Lord Maitreya, Bishop Wedgwood, still only in his middle 30s, extremely handsome and always well-dressed, made another voyage to Australia. He had to consult Leadbeater, who acted as the spokesman of the Invisible Masters, who were in constant touch with him on the astral plane. Their approval had to be obtained for the final revision of the new liturgy and other important matters. After much discussion, and presumably having consulted the Lord Maitreya, the two bishops agreed to adopt the name of the Liberal Catholic Church for their schism from Matthew's original body.